think it's critically important that broader numbers of people outside of legal scholars, outside of historians, come to have a deep understanding of how religious liberty has been shaped by race.
And if nothing else, whether they walk away with the right answers, it is my hope that those who listen in to this conversation will at least walk away with a different set of questions.
That was our Black Religious Liberty curriculum trailer that you just enjoyed. And I'll say I have had that earworm of a background music in my head for about 6 months, and now you all too, so you're welcome. Hello, everyone. I am Liz Reiner Platt. I direct the Law, Rights, and Religion Project. For those of you who are new to us at LRRP, we are a law and policy center based here at Columbia Law School that advocates for religious liberty, pluralism, and social justice. So I just want to welcome you and thank you all so much for being with us here for the launch of the Black Religious Liberty curriculum. Our team has been working so incredibly hard on this project for well over a year now, and we're just incredibly delighted to have it out in the world and share with you all today. To tell you a bit about the project, as I've said many times over the past year, this was a project that was largely born of frustration. Frustration with really an extreme lack of diversity in every sense of the word in public discussions, panels, and conferences on religion law. Frustration with the way that religion law courses and articles really often fail to acknowledge or take race and racism into account. And frustration with the way that kind of broader public conversations about religious liberty and the law often seem very preoccupied with a small set of legal cases. And really largely we're talking about legal cases brought by predominantly white Christians who are opposed to LGBTQ legal protections and reproductive rights. At the same time that other religious liberty conflicts like the surveillance of mosques, like the denial of religious rights to people who are incarcerated, like persecution of African diaspora religions, those cases just get often largely ignored. And so out of this kind of building frustration, we decided to create this curriculum that we're launching today, inspired really by some of the amazing religious freedom work that's been going on off of law school campuses, including by some of the speakers that you're going to be hearing from today. And so we created this free, entirely public 12-session video series that really puts race and, of course, specifically Black people and communities at the center of our discussions of religious freedom and what that right really means. Each of the 12 videos in the curriculum features 2 scholars in conversation. And this was a very intentionally interdisciplinary project. So we're not just talking about lawyers and law professors. You'll hear from theologians, historians, religious studies scholars, activists, tackling a broad range of subjects from religious liberty and Black power to religious liberty, race, and national security. And our goal in undertaking the project from the very beginning has been, not just to impact conversations on religion law within the legal academy, although we do think that's a really important goal, but it's also been to reach beyond the academy and really ultimately encourage a more kind of pluralistic approach to religious liberty rights and one that really puts religious freedom and racial justice in conversation and seeing them as kind of interconnected, mutually enforcing rights. So to that end, I'll note we've created a discussion guide to accompany the videos that we hope you can bring back and you can use with your students, with your classmates, with your campus clubs, and even your faith communities. The discussion guide includes reflection questions on each of the 12 sessions, and a section with recommendations for how to get involved in your community to advocate for religious liberty and pluralism. So we really hope that everyone finds watching these curriculum videos as exciting and inspiring as we found making them. And it's just inspired the really phenomenal group of 24 scholars that participated in the project who we're so thankful for. Before I turn things over to our panelists today, who I know you're eager to hear from, I do want to do one thing quickly that we don't typically do in our webinars here at LLRP, and that is to ask for your support in keeping the work of the Law, Rights, and Religion Project going. We are a very small and entirely grant-funded team, and I think that we really do a huge amount of work with quite a small budget. And I'll say that we were just so passionate and dedicated to making this project in particular happen that we kind of rubbed two pennies together to make it happen. Along the way, we were actually told we could not have a project of this scale with the budget that we had, and we made it happen. And moreover, we decided again that the curriculum should be free and there shouldn't be any barriers to accessing it. As we look ahead to the future, we have a lot more planned, both for the curriculum, but also for other projects. We are the only organization providing strategic support on religion law to faith groups that are fighting for issues like reproductive rights and immigrants' rights. We're undertaking new research on how religious exemptions can limit the right to collective bargaining and other forms of labor rights. And in the face of, we've all heard about it, Project 2025 and kind of rising the white Christian nationalist vision, we are just working to to advance in an alternative vision of what religious liberty law should look like, and one that's grounded in pluralism and in democratic values. But we can't do any of those projects without the funding to keep us going. So I just want to take a very quick opportunity to ask anyone who does have the capacity, if you've learned from our work, if you've used our resources, or if you're planning to use our resources, please do consider making a donation, which you can do by going to our website. At the moment, we're actually running a campaign and offering new donors books from our Black Religious Liberty curriculum library. And again, you can learn more about that on the website. So with our small but mighty team, a little donation really goes a long way for us. So with that, I will turn to our amazing speakers today, and I am going to keep introductions quite brief so we can get right to it. So joining us today, we have Dr. Sabrina Dent, Director of the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation at Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. Dr. Dent is also the co-editor, along with Dean Corey D.B. Walker, speaker in session 5 of the curriculum, of African Americans and Religious Freedom, New Perspectives for Congregations and Communities. We are also joined by Dr. Judith Weisenfeld, a professor and chair of the Department of Religion at Princeton University. She's also the director of the Crossroads Project on Black Religious Histories, Communities, and Cultures, and author of New World A Coming, Black Religion and Racial Identity During the Great Migration. And last but very much not least, Rahmah Abdulaleem is executive director of Soulful Muslims, Empowering African American Muslims. She's also co-chair of the Religious Freedom Committee of the American Bar Association's section on civil rights and social justice, and a member of the Bar Association's task force to combat Islamophobia. So we're going to have about 50 minutes of conversation, followed by some Q&A time, so get your questions ready. And to kick off the panel and the conversation, so I already kind of shared and said my piece about my frustrations with the religious liberty discourse as it stands today. But I want to hear what our other panelists think. Do they agree? Do they disagree? Kind of what is your perception of religious liberty, what it means for us today? Do you see any problems in your field or in the broader discourse? And I'm going to kick it off with Dr. Dent, because your work, again, was just a huge inspiration for the project. And so I want to kind of start with you and hear about how you've tackled this question of, what is religious liberty and what are the kind of limits of the discourse today?
Thank you so much, Liz. It's an honor to be on this panel with Rahmah and Dr. Weisenfeld and to have this conversation that is long overdue. And especially looking at this topic through the lens of the legal experience is critical right now. And so in my work, I've been very fortunate to be a part of the religious freedom field for almost 10 years. And in this, the narrative has always centered around really a white male heterosexual narrative and Christian. That has been really the narrative about religious freedom in this country. And fortunately, in 2018, you mentioned Dr. Corey D.B. Walker, that we had the opportunity to work on a project called Religious Freedom, African American Perspectives. And Rahmah worked with us on that project as well. And it was funded by the Henry Luce Foundation. And the reality was that we looked at an opportunity, we saw an opportunity to create a course and curriculum around talking about African Americans and religious freedom, which was a topic that really had not been explored as deeply as we did. With the 9 scholars that we worked with, and in partnership with the 6 historically Black theological institutions. And for us, it was about really bringing together museum education, theological education, and civic education to look at the experiences of Black people in America, which have often been limited and just relegated to just talking about race, but not looking at the ways in which race has been impacted and the communities have been impacted in various ways around religious freedom in this country, or the lack of religious freedom, let's state it that way. And so for us, is really been this question about asking the question, who has the right to be human? Like, that's ultimately for us what we've explored in our work. Who has the right to be human? Who has the right to live and thrive in society? And one of the things that I appreciate is that I had the opportunity to preview some of the talks that have been recorded for the Black Religious Liberty curriculum. And I really appreciated the way in which the presenters leaned in to talk about the Black codes and the slave codes, because I think conversations around religious freedom, that people that have historically been a part of this narrative exclude the experiences of Black people that have often been targeted by laws that have consistently changed when they did not want to afford us our freedom, not just our religious freedom, because it was about our human freedom. So it has been very frustrating. And the unfortunate thing is that we continue to see that play out in the public square today, whether we're talking about religious minorities, or if we're talking about racial minorities, it continues to happen in terms of who has the right to live and thrive and to be in society. So there is a lot of frustration around it. And that's why the work that we did with the book was an introduction for communities to get a deeper understanding, to really like put their toe in the water to say, okay, we need to reimagine what this looks like in talking about religious freedom. That is not just about the freedom of conscience, the right to believe or not to believe, but really it's about one's right to fully show up in society with all their human rights and freedoms and civil liberties. And so that, unfortunately, in 2024 is still on the table.
That was a huge theme in the curriculum is, you can't talk about any of these individual rights in isolation. They just don't work that way. That's not how they work in people's lives. And to that end, I wonder if, we spoke about this earlier, but Judith, if I may, I don't know, I should have asked if I could use first name.
Please.
One thing that in the curriculum came up again and again is, some of the speakers would say, well, I'm not a legal expert. Right. But I would say, but you are, when you look at how the law impacts people's lives. Like, you might not be, your scholarship might not lie in the Supreme Court, but you absolutely are a legal expert, because the law is so integral, again, not just to religious freedom, but to all the rights and the complicated ways that they intersect. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about your work and the way that you have looked at kind of the law impacting people's kind of lived religious experiences.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for putting this together. It's an amazing resource, and being invited to do this has challenged me to think about my own work again in a slightly different context than I had when I took it up. Although, as a scholar of religion, as somebody in religious studies, one of the things that preoccupies me is, what do people mean when they say religion, right? In religious studies, we are concerned with religion as a category that is not obvious. It's not just out there, but that it is created in particular historical and social contexts, and it's deployed by people to particular ends. And so my questions are in part about what kind of substance do people invest that category of religion with, and how does it get used to create insiders and outsiders? And so in my own work on Black new religious movements of the early 20th century, I'm thinking about how, from their perspective, racialization has shaped their experience of religion and shapes their religious claims. So in the groups I look at, the Moorish Science Temple, the Nation of Islam, Father Divine's Peace Mission, and various groups that I group under the umbrella of Ethiopian Hebrew, they're making claims about themselves. That they understand to be divine commands, that they are not Negroes in the prevailing racial categories, and they're not Christian in conventional ways, but they feel called by divine mandate to assert a what I call a religio-racial identity that combines religion and race. And the responses to them are often from census enumerators, or I spent a lot of time with vital records, government documents, with draft registrars, insisting that they could not assert these categories in the context of state-determined racial classification systems, and that their religious claims didn't help them to make these kind of racial claims. And so, what's going on there is that that government agents, state agents, are saying to people who are asserting their religious identity that is shaped by their racial identity, these state agents are kind of refusing to accord them the status of religion. And so I was really interested in how, what happened when the both kind of the religious, racial, and kind of legal imagination of members of these groups in the early 20th century met state categories or ideas about what religion is, and those ideas are grounded in white Protestantism ultimately. So Sabrina just said, questions about, what freedom of conscience and belief, and the idea that religion equals sincerely held belief is not something that we should assume. So I always want to ask, in a context, where does that come from, and how do ideas about race shape the conception of religion and produce insider and outsider? So religion is a relational category that functions in a social context.
Thank you so much. And Rahmah, I think your work is so interesting because you do a lot of kind of movement work, right? You're working in the community with your with soulful Muslims, but you also are a part of this, let's say, like, very kind of elite organization, the American Bar Association. That's what we think of when we think of like the law, right? And the legal system. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit how you see kind of those two types of work and relationship, and what can people learn from each other? And again, how your kind of response to this term that we're kind of grappling with of religious liberty, seen through both of those different kind of perspectives, right? How is the American Bar Association approaching religious liberty, and how are, the folks the kind of community-based building you do, like, how does that approach religious liberty, and how, if there are any kind of tensions there? I'd be very interested.
Well, thank you for letting me join this great conversation. What's always fascinating to me is that when, as a lawyer, I go into a room and say I want to talk about religious freedom, I'm usually probably, if maybe there's one other woman in the room, maybe there's one other Black person in the room, probably not. It's usually filled with uh, white men above a certain age. Sometimes there are people who are not Protestants. You know, there's a very strong tradition of some Jewish scholars in this religious freedom work, but it's something that oftentimes, even their best, they want to make sure that they're diverse and reaching out to people, but because they don't have any kind of connection to the people that it actually affects, they don't really even know when they're using certain terminology, how it's going to be reflected back on them. So even hearing religious liberty, if you ask the average person what religious liberty means, they're like, that means I can do what I want as long as I say it's based on my religion. And it's like, yeah, that's not right. You know, that's what you think it means, but that's not what it means for, the legal institutions. But for a lot of people, and especially being a member of a minority faith here in the United States, I sometimes deal with people who are like, oh, I have this freedom of religion, and because I'm an American, I can do, this applies to me too. And so it's kind of really giving people a history lesson of, when these rights came into being, they weren't thinking about you. And for a lot of people, they're still not thinking about you. And they're like, yes, they are. And, I want to go protest at the school board meeting about my religious freedom being, they're not taking my religion seriously because my child has to say pronouns or something like that has come up recently. And it's kind of like, oh my gosh, and what can I do? And it's really kind of trying to inform people of what religious freedom actually is and religious liberty actually is, and really getting them to kind of think outside the box. Because I think all too often people just assume that means me too. And it's a great way of being, is that you always think that everything applies to you and that you have the same freedom. And it's sometimes hard for me to come back and say, well, they didn't really mean you. And no, we probably have a slightly different reaction. For example, the Supreme Court case with the football coach, and they were like, oh, so now my child can start praying on the sidelines. I'm like, not quite sure that you'd have the same reaction that this Christian man bowing down midfield, if it was a Muslim saying the call to prayer, I'm not sure you're going to have the same reaction. So don't assume because it's okay for one group that it's okay for you. And so really getting really kind of communities and congregations to really think about it and see how race has played a part. Because too often people are like, no, religion is bigger than race. And, we're all one human race and it shouldn't matter. And it's like, okay, do I need to give you examples of how it matters? So this project is really putting race in the forefront. And some people are still upset when race comes into the forefront because they don't want to talk about it. But we know that not talking about it doesn't make it go away. And so really that's to me what the most important part of this project is that when people start talking about it, then we can actually educate people. Then people can see beyond because everybody's worldview is based on your own personal experience. So there are plenty of people who are like, everything's fine and my neighbors like me, and like they know Muslims. There are a lot of people who don't know any Muslims because they don't live in a neighborhood with Muslims. All they see is what they see on television. Or, oh, I have a Black friend at school, but they don't live near Black people. They don't realize that maybe their friend at school, practices a religion that they've never heard of, but it is a religion. It's kind of like, oh, they're not one of these. If they're not one of these, is that actually a religion or is that a cultural thing? So really starting for us to start talking about, you know, how Dr. Judith said, it's like, how do you define religion? Because people in their mind, it's like religion is you go to church on Sunday. As a Muslim, I don't go to church on Sunday. Sunday is not my religious day. Saturday's not, Friday afternoon is my religious day. So people are like, Friday, you get to what? And so really getting people to start talking about ways in which any religion is different, especially about race here in the United States. Like race still matters in the United States.
Yes.
And as much as we want to say that we're like this post-racial society, race still matters, and race matters in the discussion about religious freedom and religious liberty.
Rahmah, I appreciate that you stated that about what applies to a person and what doesn't, right? I think it is important for people to look at history and, because we have the First Amendment, but also we need to think about who the First Amendment applied to at that time. And although we in 2024 can say, that the First Amendment applies to us, and I say that in quotes because we know the realities of what we see happening in the public square right now. I mean, with Christian nationalism on the rise right now, I think it's important for us to name that. But bringing it back to this curriculum, I think it's critically important because the focus is also looking at culturally and also how the law treated Black people differently. So one of the things that I'm often reminded of in the work that we do in talking about religious freedom is looking at the Naturalization Act of 1790, right? And remembering that that was not afforded to Black people, to Indigenous people here in America, right? And so when you think about that, you also have to realize that these amendments that were put into play, right? So you have, the 13th Amendment. And then people have to remember that the Emancipation Proclamation was different from the 13th Amendment in terms of who was given their freedoms. So it's critically important for people to look at how the law treated Black people in this country. But the reason why I mentioned the Naturalization Act is that what it meant to be a citizen is that you were a white, male, land owning, and you had the right to vote. And so when you look at the amendments in this country and you look at like the right to vote didn't come much later for formerly enslaved people. And so I think it's critical to look at how laws are applied, or even thinking about even with religions within Christianity. One of the things I appreciated in the conversation that Dr. Audrey and Reverend Kelly Brown Douglas had in talking about, Christianity and how, the notion of baptism was to really set people free. But baptism did not set people free. But the absolute, I'm so sorry, my alarm is going off, that it did not set people free. But it was this change and thinking about, who had the right to really be free. But baptism was supposed to do it because you're supposed to now be free in Christ, but yet you're not free in like the free world, right? And so what does that mean? Again, it's critically important. Also, in thinking about who the law applies to, we had this conversation when we were prepping for the call and talking about when you look at the religious freedom cases that have happened in this country, right now, I'm in Montgomery, Alabama. It is not lost on me that I am at the center of the civil rights movement. It is not lost on me that just years ago, Dominic Ray, a Black Muslim man, was on death row and requested his imam to be present for his last rites of passage and was denied that. And of course, ultimately executed. So when we look at like religious freedom cases, let's look at who's being impacted by it. Let's look at who is actually being given, the right to practice their freedoms or to really just be free as human beings. So I think it's critically important for us to look at history and the way history has played a huge role in that. One of the other things that I'm mindful of is I had the opportunity to visit the new International African American Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. And there is a placard on the wall that talks about the fundamental constitutions of Carolina. And in that, it specifically states that that no matter what, if a person was of Negro descent, that no matter what their beliefs were, that they were not to be free. So again, the question is it really about our ability to have religious freedom, or is it really about our ability to be free human beings? And so that is, I think, that's why this project is so critical, because you look at it through the lens and experiences of different categories. And we haven't even talked about the violence of religious freedom.
And one of the things this discussion is bringing up for me that I don't think we talked about earlier when we met is the relationship, the kind of tension between disestablishment and religious freedom, and the disestablishment that I talk about with my students in terms of separation of church and state, and that we talk about it in that way. To begin with, is a question for or that we continue to talk about it in that way is something we should think about. But that disestablishment, that there is no formal governmental religion, endorsed religion, doesn't mean that the government doesn't kind of see like and act like a white Protestant church in lots of ways, right? So questions about, these go back historically about, blue laws, Sunday laws, restrictions on activities on the Sabbath, which is only certain people's Sabbath, constrains other people's religious freedom. And so that tension is something that is really of interest to me. And it comes up again, the kinds of, I'm very interested in religious groups that are outside of the mainstream, whether it be, outside of the mainstream of the Black church tradition. And when you look at the cases of constraint on members of those kinds of religious groups, you can really see the bounds of, again, how government actors and the state see and perform a certain kind of Protestant Christianity. And so one of the cases of a member of the Moorish Science Temple in my book was drafted or enlisted in the army in World War II. I think he was probably drafted. He was happy, he was willing to serve, which was not the case for members of the Nation of Islam, for example. But he lived in Camden. He went into basic training, and he asserted, he said, I'm a member of the Moorish Science Temple. My religion requires me to have a beard, to cover my head in a particular way, and to eat vegetarian food. And at first, the army accommodated him, but launched an investigation into his racial claim of being a kind of Moorish Muslim. And they decided, and this is reported in the newspapers, that he was simply a Negro, which meant he couldn't be Muslim, in a genuine way, and required him to shave his beard, uncover, wear a military uniform, and to eat whatever they put in front of him. And so this is the way that race inflects this tension between separation of church and state and exercise of religious freedom.
But what's so fascinating is that in 2024, there's still people who think that the United States is a Christian nation, that will argue with you that the United States is a Christian nation. It's like, do we not all learn that same history of, we were founded on this religious freedom? But some people are like, oh, well, we were founded for white Protestants. And so white Protestants have religious freedom, but nobody else does. And people are like, is that right? It's like, well, that's what the founders were thinking about. They might have been influenced by interacting with other cultures, but for some people, they're like, this is a Christian nation. And even we respect other people's religion, but we want the Bible to be taught in all public schools in Oklahoma. And really for people the reaction that people are like, but what's the big deal? That's why schools have gone downhill, because they've taken the Bible out of schools. And it's like, there's really a lack of awareness of how it makes people feel when it's not their holy book that is the focus. And the kind of otherization that we have been doing about so many different communities. If you don't believe in Old Testament, the New Testament, Sabrina and I, just a couple of weeks ago, I was like, Sabrina, my niece goes to a Catholic school. I don't know what Bible to get off of Amazon. Please help me. And, it was one of those things that for some people that you'd be like, of course, I know you want the King James Version. You want there were all these initials. And I was like, I don't know what to do. There's so many options. But that's me as someone who is like, okay, I need to get the information, let me get it. But there's really no interest, it seems, from the other side to get to know people who are not in this kind of like, oh, I am white Christian Protestant, everything revolves around me. And because everything revolves around me, I don't need to know about you. And so it's really, when you talk about religious liberty, it's so often this group that pretends that they are being discriminated against. But I'm like, how can you be the largest group and you're being discriminated? It's like, you're being mean to me. I'm like, wait a second, but you're in charge. And I got whiffs of that in a lot of the Supreme Court decisions. It's kind of like, you're not you're not standing up for us, so we need to stand up for the little guy being this religious liberty right. And it's like, that's a right they always had. Like, why are we making this into they're the little guy that needs to be protected when they really are kind of the majority that has really been out there for the longest time, really experiencing and being the benefactors of religious freedom. So it's really something that people need to think about. And I would say one other thing. So often people who are not Black don't always think that something like Black religious freedom applies to them. And I often tell them that the struggle for civil rights started with Black people, but we opened the door for everybody. And
Yes.
without us opening the door for everybody, a lot of the immigrants would not be here in the United States today. So I always tell people, it's like, you should learn from the history of what Black people went through for religious liberty, because it can tell you really the story of America. And it can tell, it encompasses things about the Chinese Exclusion Act that comes into play dealing with Black people and religious freedom. So I think that too often people are like, I'm not Black, it doesn't apply to me. It does apply to you. And really learning about what Black people went through for religious liberty and religious freedom can really inform lots of groups about what this country has to offer.
One of the kind of there are a lot of sort of through lines in the curriculum, and I've had the honor of watching all of the sessions many times, and so you start to see patterns. And one thing that comes up quite a lot are, we have this powerful narrative of religious freedom in this country, right? I think we all three of you, I think, spoke about the power of this idea of religious liberty and how it's the kind of, even this, we can call it a civil religion, right? Like this thing is, this is the founding of one of the founding fundamental values. And how do we reconcile that kind of that narrative with the reality of the surveillance of mosques, with the reality of the widespread attacks on Black churches and during these different periods of history up until today. And so one of the ways that's reconciled, I mean, one of the speakers in the curriculum, Sahar Aziz, did a wonderful book called The Racial Muslim, where she talks about, well, one way to reconcile that, particularly in the Muslim context, is just to say, this is not in fact a religion, it's a race. But I think another way that this has come up in different circumstances is that these different religious communities, and this kind of gets to what you were talking about with Judith, with also the example of the Moorish Science Temple, which you are not a religious group, you're a racial group. And also often it's not a religion, but it's a political group. And we saw that very much with the Nation of Islam, for example. This, we're not going to give you these special rights incarcerated people because you're not actually a religion, you're actually a hate group or a political group. Even, people we revere today, right? Martin Luther King Jr., this is actually political. This is communism. This is, what have you. And so I think it just, I'm just pulling from kind of a lot of what different folks said, is I think that's something that, how do we deal with this kind of wide gap between the myth and the reality? Well, that's one way that I think we've seen again and again, and that comes up in the curriculum quite a bit.
Yeah, I think that speaks to a larger issue there. So I think what concerns me is what I have known and what I continue to hear, right, is that Black people, of course, in this country have not been afforded the same rights and privileges that other groups have been afforded when it comes to expressing our religious or non-religious identities, right? And that we have simply been seen as Black. That's why historically people may have only looked at the bombing of the Birmingham, the 16th Street Baptist Church, right? The bombing in Birmingham, Alabama, that killed the 4 girls and injured many, right, as just a racial act and not a religious freedom violation, right? And that was one of the things that you even pointed out in talking about the attacks on mosques and even Guardaras. We can go down the line of all the different religious communities that have often been targeted. Speaks to the violence of religious freedom in the sense that the question again goes back to who has the right to be here for some and who has the right to be human. And I can't keep driving that enough because of the realities of it is that if someone can use the law to weaponize communities and to weaponize belief systems to disenfranchise other communities, then you can minimize their value and their value to society. Because we have to also remember that when Black people were violently brought to this country, it was for the intentions of the country and for those that were a part of the international slave trade and transatlantic slave trade for their benefit and for their gain. And so I think it is important for us to remember like these threads when people say, I don't understand the connection between a woman's right to choose reproductive freedom and religious freedom or bodily autonomy. What does that mean when we know that our bodies have always been on the line or subject to the laws based on whatever beliefs people held? And so I think it is important for us to make that known and to thread that as it has been done through this curriculum, as it's been talked about in various ways. One of the first things that I watched was when they were talking about African religions, right? And so, when people were violently brought to this country, they came with their religious beliefs and they came with their gods. But because we were not seen as human, then it was believed that there wasn't such a thing as religion or religious ideas that were held by formerly enslaved Africans. So I think, again, that says a lot about how the law and how people who have interpreted and dictated the law have treated people of color and Black people in this country. And like we said, we still see it. And what I'm also, Judith, I would love for you to touch on what you talked about with us in terms of how that was even utilized within spaces where people were in institutions, like mental health institutions, because again, it points back to who has the right to be and believe or to just show up.
Right. I was just thinking about this in part because one of the things what you were just saying, Sabrina, made me think about is that, it's important to, so I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a legal scholar. And it's also important for us not to separate the law as an arena from other powerful actors in American society. And so in the book I just finished, I have been thinking about the intersections of law and medicine in psychiatry and how they collaborated to make them agents in this, to do this same kind of work of withholding the protections of religion from Black people on the basis of or through mobilizing racialized ideas about what religion is and what it means to be a kind of human participant in the American nation. And so, to be more specific, the book looks at how white psychiatrists beginning in the 1880s or in the immediate post-Reconstruction period produced theories about the relationship of religion to Black religion to mental illness among formerly enslaved people. And the theories were about ideas about natural propensities, religious propensities among Black people. Black people are naturally superstitious. And therefore, these religious practices, this particular set, conjure, health and healing practices, that's not religion, that's superstition. Black people are naturally predisposed to emotional excess. And so certain kinds of Christian revivalist practices, holiness, Pentecostal, speaking in tongues, that's not true religion, that's emotional excess. People who join new religious movements, they're just gullible dupes of cult leaders. And so that's not real religion. And so, on the basis of all of these ideas about, about what constitutes real religion, people were committed through legal process to mental institutions throughout the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. And so, and there's a very long tail on this as well. One can take it in many directions, but I think about this in relation to the mobilization of, or the creation and mobilization of excited delirium as a diagnosis that police give, either to explain why they had to murder a particular Black man or to describe his cause of death and it's most often men, but in when being held in jail, and excited delirium is in many ways, right? We can't draw a direct line, but it is the afterlife of the kind of late 19th century religious excitement that I found in or in psychiatric theories that were again enabled. The effect of that, the theory is one thing, but it is the legal system that embraced it in that period and consigned people to mental hospitals. And sometimes people obviously needed care, but in other ways it was simply a violation of religious freedom by saying that's not religion, that's mental illness. And we know this because we have all of these racialized theories about true religion versus false religion.
But even that question is what's always so fascinating, is that who decides what is true and what is false? And unfortunately,
a bunch of white Protestant men.
Exactly. But unfortunately, it's been the legal system and whoever is working in the, law enforcement. If the police officer doesn't believe you, like, oh, what is that smell? And you're like, oh, this is part of my religious practice and we were burning incense or something. Oh no, I think that's I think you're driving under the influence. Like you're under, you're not, driving under the influence of some kind of drug, and you need to be drug tested because it doesn't smell right to me. And so really, I think you're correct that the legal system has really kind of used their own thinking about what is religion, what is not, to really justify even how we prosecute certain people based on, I think you're just saying that's a religion, so that's your excuse, when other people can use it and be like, oh, they can have that. Yeah, that's very logical that they, say it's a religious belief. So it's really kind of who decides what is religion and what's not. And that's so fascinating because we're supposed to have this separation of church and state, but there's ways in which religion and church seep into even our legal system all the time.
But it always has. Like, I think we have to state that it always has, like, and that the church has played a critical part in a lot of ways in which Black people in this country have been treated, also how the laws have been dictated. One of the things that I think about quite often is I'm from the state of Virginia. And so, in the state of Virginia, I often talk about Walter Plecker, who was a white man who was the son of a Confederate soldier, who was a devout Christian. And he was the first person to be the registrar for the Virginia Bureau of Vital Statistics. That's the person that determines who you are based on your racial identity on your birth certificate. And this was someone who believed that God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah because of race mixing. So he was the one that also instituted the one drop rule. He was also the one that instituted the Racial Integrity Act of 1922, I believe. So it's like, so here you have a government actor that is making up laws based on his beliefs, and these things are being instituted. And if anybody remembers that the Racial Integrity Act is what made it illegal for the Levins to be married until the Supreme Court, made it illegal to discriminate against interracial couples. So I think it's important for people to think about like how this shows up, not just historically, but how is it showing up today, right? That is one of the concerns for me. And that's why I appreciate how the curriculum touches all these different areas to say, look at how, Blacks have been treated no matter what their beliefs are throughout time. And then how is this showing up in the current context? And so I think right now in this current context, for me, seeing what's happening even with the implications of Project 2025, right? Like that, I think that has to be stated as well, that has huge implications for Black communities when you're talking about, gutting out public education. When we know that, public education, when you think about vouchers and the reason why vouchers existed were to defy desegregation orders. Everything, when people say things are not political, everything is political. And so with that, there's just so much for us to pay attention to in the public square around how history continues to shape the experiences of Black people in this country and our experiences with the law.
And all of the discussion about what's going on and not going on in Springfield, Ohio right now is directly related again to a very long history of stereotypes and vilification of Afro-Caribbean religions, right, as not religion, as something dangerous and, again, not appropriate for the American context and not deserving, again, not that, right, that not deserving of the protections of religious liberty. So instead of, right, stepping out and saying, foregrounding the complexity and beauty and diversity of religious practices among Haitian immigrants in America, people are just, allowing the, public discourse is allowing that kind of stereotype that led to, again, constraint on religious liberty to flow free.
I wanted to pick up quickly on your mention of loving, Sabrina, because again, it makes me think of another one of these kind of through lines is the way in which this narrative of religious liberty has been advanced, kind of adopted to advance really kind of projects, we can call them political projects, religious projects, like all across the spectrum, right? So you have religious liberty, you have for example, the trial court judge in the Loving case who says, I am upholding this anti-miscegenation law because God Almighty created the races and put them on separate continents. And essentially this is the way that God wants it to be, is to on the other hand, well before Loving, decades before Loving, you actually had an interracial couple in California bring a religious liberty suit. It was a Catholic couple saying, our God tells us this is my person. It was an interracial couple wanting to marry across the color line when that was illegal, not in the South, in California, and brought a religious liberty suit to strike down an anti-miscegenation law. So I just thought that was a case that not many people have heard of, and I think that was really important to see that, how many different forms this idea of religious freedom takes, even when you do intersect it with race, it's not one narrative. So I want to encourage folks, again, to put your questions in the Q&A. And we have one question that I do want to throw into the mix, because I know we talked about this actually earlier and we haven't hit upon it today, which is we had someone ask about the difference between religious freedom and religious liberty. And I will admit to being one of the people who kind of use these terms interchangeably, even though maybe I shouldn't. I probably shouldn't. But you know, I tend to reflect the kind of common words that people use in the legal discourse, and I'll say religious liberty is probably the thing that you will see in most religion law conversations. But I know some of you do really kind of lean into the distinctions between those terms. So I'll throw it back to anyone who wants to jump in.
I don't mind the intermingling. I think that I don't mind the intermingling of the two terms because I refuse to let someone take religious liberty as if only they can have it. And so I have seen religious liberty used against anyone who is not a white Christian so often that I'm just like, no, 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 you're not going to have that word. It's not going to be just your word. Because yes, I think you are correct that a lot of the Supreme Court cases try to use religious liberty, and a lot of people who end up somehow being selected for their cases to even be at the Supreme Court really focus on this kind of liberty. And, you know, it really to me plays on the like, give me liberty, give me death kind of mentality that we have in America. But I use them interchangeably. I know Sabrina thinks of one is bigger than the other, so I'll let her go next.
Yes, I typically use religious freedom. For me, the notion of freedom is so significant and important as far as one's ability to fully be human and to fully be seen, heard, and accepted into society, and to have one's full rights, civil and human rights. And so that's why I use the word freedom more often than liberty, because it encompasses many different areas of a person's being and humanity for me. But I do understand, and I appreciate Rahmah stating that, you know, for one not to take ownership of, you know, liberty, that is relegated for a certain group. I wholeheartedly appreciate that and will hold on to that as I continue to use the language of freedom. But I appreciate that because I don't want someone to take ownership of it and then say, oh, this is only for us, right? If it's especially in the work that we do at our organization, we talk about faith freedom for all. And so it is critically important for us to think about that very broadly. And, you know, when I think of the notion of freedom, I think of, and I won't quote it exactly but the quote by Elizabeth Freeman, who said, you know, that if she could have just had one moment of freedom on God's earth, right, what that would have meant to her. And I think that's significant to just think about historically what freedom means in a broader sense of being able to be fully realized, fully present, fully accepted, and to have all the other abilities and freedoms that other people have in society that haven't been afforded to us. So, and then when you add religion into that, there's a whole nother layer to navigate.
I was the one who brought this up to begin with or I asked the same question of my co-panelists, as someone not in the field of religious freedom or religious liberty law, but because my association with the liberty part of it is like religious liberty as the umbrella, my association is with a certain set of organized white Christian activists, or I will say evangelical, because they also have co-opted Christian to themselves. But right, who are claiming religious liberty in their cases, and I would be interested to know. I don't have the answer. Sort of when it emerged as the term. I mean, it feels to me as if it's something that really came into or kind of overtook religious freedom maybe in the 1990s or 2000s or something. I would be really interested to have someone historicize that for me. But it's an association I have with a particular kind of claim that feels to me like a claim about a kind of individual liberty to act, and that the umbrella of religious freedom to me, is attached to the constitutional language of free exercise. And that can be an individual claim, but it feels to me like it has more potential to think about people's responsibility to each other and connection and community, whereas liberty, again, feels like it's my right to do this and to deny you something, right? Or your existence denies me the right to, the liberty to be a certain way. And so, as I said, it's vibes mostly on my part that one feels that it emerged out of a plan to make certain kinds of cases, and the other has a kind of longer, broader history. But I do, again, appreciate, Rahmah, your insistence on not allowing others to have it as their exclusive property, because we do live in a discursive landscape in which it is an important way of talking about the kind of thing we're all interested in.
Yeah, and it has really become a thing.
Right.
I mean, to say that almost all of the most recent cases that we would, my committee at the American Bar Association, the cases that are they religious freedom cases, and then the language that the court uses is religious liberty. So it has been really, I think you're right, it has become the thing in the last like 30 years, and it feels like it was a plan to start using this language. I don't know what the plan was, but by using this language, it does seem to have separated out some people and some people's ability to use it. So really, that's why, to me, it's very important to try to take back the language. Just like, I'm not a Christian, but I really wish more Christians would really take back the term Christian and term Christianity and, Christian voters, because it's really become, when you watch it, you're like, Christian voters vote this way. I'm like, well, white Protestant Christian voters vote that way, but do every other group vote that way? Or, no, all Christians don't support this candidate, because I know a few churches that have. So really kind of taking back the language, because I think that, similar to how Muslims have tried really hard to take back the narrative that we're not all terrorists, and like everything that we say, speaking in Arabic and giving the greetings, with growing up saying assalamu alaikum to somebody else was cool. There was a time in, after 9/11 that you couldn't even say that, because you were worried that people are going to be like, oh my gosh, she's a but I think it's the same way that even people nowadays who are Christian need to take back the term Christian, because it has really become kind of put out there in the public square of, you think a certain way because you are Christian. And what they're saying to me is, because you follow white Christianity, whatever white Christians do has to be right. And as a Muslim, I constantly, in dealing with my community, they were like, well, Christians get to do this and Christians do that. I'm like, okay, it's like when people say Americans and they don't mean Black people, they only mean white people. It's the same thing that I feel like people get to with Christians. And I think that this curriculum will help people start thinking about Christianity being much broader than just this very narrow, it's not even it's maybe evangelical. I don't know what the right term is, but it's a very Americanized Christianity that has really, white Americanized Christianity that's really taken over, and people have like, that must be the right way, and I want to be just like them. So really, the discussion about liberty and freedom, I feel it should be interchangeable until everyone has it.
Again, please drop your questions in the chat. But I will also say I would be remiss as director of LLRP if I didn't mention we have a media guide on religious liberty, actually, that tries to get at that very thing, Rahmah, of getting the folks who are writing about religious liberty to just take a step back and think about, like, what is it I'm writing about? And if I say religious liberty and I mean a religious right to, let's say, deny abortion care, but not a religious right to provide abortion care, well, is that religious liberty or is that something else? And so we have a media guide that is kind of how to tackle those tough questions and how to take a step back and say, when I use the term religious liberty, am I who am I talking about? What groups am I talking about? What beliefs am I talking about? And what beliefs am I maybe not talking about? So I'll just mention that we do have that resource for anyone interested. And also, I am also not a non-Christian, so I will take a step back and say it's not my place certainly to weigh in on the theological questions or anything. But I will say that folks who are kind of interested in that conversation will, I think, be particularly interested in the session on sexuality, religious liberty, race, and sexuality, with session 12. And Professor Russell Robinson in that session said something that I thought was very interesting and powerful, which was, that we hear so much about, the rights in this context, like the religious right to do X, Y, and Z. I have a religious right to, deny the cake or whatever. And he says, I'm a person, he's a person of faith. I'm a person of faith, he says. And I don't really hear the Bible talking a lot about rights. Like that's not the term, right? It's about care for others, love of neighbor. And so, again, I don't want to speak for him but I think that I thought that was a very interesting point he made, is like the kind of the disconnect, again, this focus on rights in the legal sphere, when that's maybe not reflective of Christianity as he understands it. So I don't know if one of you wants to vamp while I read this large question that just came in.
Well, I will say that I think that because of the way recent Supreme Court cases have come down, they have really put religious freedom back into the mainstream. I think for a little while, people had stopped talking about it. And then it became, like, oh, we have this super majority and we can now go and save everyone by putting in all of these restrictions. And so even like just cases that there have been so many cases that have come down since the change in the Supreme Court makeup, and really kind of focusing on like, oh, we're doing this for all people. And I will say that what really came to the forefront for me was when the Dobbs decision came out and they had a description of when life began that did not coincide with what I believe as a Muslim. And I was like, they're putting it down as this is a fact that everyone agrees with. And it's not. And really getting people to say, like, this is why, this is why I disagree with this decision, because it really just kind of erases me from even any discussion, because I don't agree with how they are setting up the whole paradigm of when abortions can happen. And so I think that that is very interesting, that it's something that you're like, wow, y'all are we're here. Like this, because it was something that they did not need to include, but they did anyway. And by including that, they kind of like, to me, this has become, reproductive freedom has become a religious freedom issue because they have made it a religious freedom issue. And there are a lot of issues that I feel that the Supreme Court has made into religious freedom issues because they have tried to put what they consider, oh, it's a known fact and everybody agrees. But it is a very particular Christian view about particular things that they have tried to put in to the law as if it is, okay, it's everybody agrees with it, and are shocked when it's pushback. And I'm like, you didn't think anybody was going to push back on this? It's like, yeah, people are going to push back. So it's really something that I think that I did not think we were still going to be here in 2024. I did not think that in 2024 we were going to have to explain to people how that's probably not a good look. We explain to what is, the Establishment Clause, the separation of church and state. Like, I didn't think that we would still be here, but we clearly are still here at that point.
So we got very interesting questions. So we've already kind of dug into this complex different ways in which people understand religious liberty, but we had a question that talks about how kind of in the more theological or religious side, like there's also highly contested terminology around, the Bible being the literal word of God, and how that, is a basic tenet of not all, but many Christians. And yet even that has different meanings, when you cut through by race or by denomination or things like that. So the question is, how do you engage in scholarship when even descriptive words like fundamentalist, evangelical, that, would seem to have maybe a kind of a simple religious definition, but again, has these actually very nuanced kind of racial and political meanings or layers to them. Does anyone want to jump in?
The force of that question, or the background of it, is the idea that when you look at white evangelical voters, litigants, that it's assumed that they're informed by a certain kind of religious, theological commitment, and then looking at Black Christian voters, litigants. Race is foregrounded, and there's a kind of less of a sense of kind of religious, right? They don't own the term Christian. It doesn't come to the fore. It's not the thing that's imagined to be driving them, because they are not biblical literalists or ascribing to certain kinds of conservative theological positions. And so what to do with, like, who do we mean when we say evangelical, is one way to put that question, right? Why is it circumscribed by race in a way that only white people get to be the kind of really committed, theologically committed actors in this, whereas other people aren't? And, I think it's, this is not, I don't tend to write about these sorts of things, but I think it's a kind of all hands on deck solution that requires the media, maybe first and foremost, to stop saying, or even, the Pew polls, there's evangelicals, American evangelicals, and there's Black Protestants. Like, what do these categories mean to you, and why have you mobilized them in this way? And so to be either, to be precise about it, why are you separating out people who might be Black conservative evangelicals into that category? And what is the effect of doing that? And also to just be precise about the language you use, and think and historicize it. And to, I think, the absence of space to recognize that there are people in America who are progressive evangelicals, who are activists for certain things that overlap with people who are not religious, who are other religions, to really attend to the complicated religious landscape is going to be really important for people in the media, for people in the legal field, for those of us talking about the history of race in America, to really not just default to these easy categories. Evangelicals are this, and Black Protestants are this other thing. So,
because it excludes, say, Black Catholics or Black evangelicals.
exactly.
It's like,
Sure.
if you do not fall into the nice category that they want you to be in, they really are like, oh, where do you go? And it's really kind of otherizing groups.
Yeah, I think it's very complicated when you bring theological language into the conversation about these issues, especially when you think about, as Judith pointed out, like, people are across the spectrum in terms of their beliefs and how they show up. So there are lots of complexities to it. Also, I think it's important for people to understand that just because someone holds a particular religious or non-religious identity may not be, like, that might not fully be their belief system, right? They might ascribe to that identity for other reasons. And I think about the work of one of my former colleagues when he talked about, Ben Marcus talked about the 3Bs framework in terms of behavior, belief, and belonging, that there are different reasons why people associate with the religious identities that they hold. So I think also some problems or challenges with like the polls, like when they do the like you said, the research groups do these polls, is that they really don't take a deeper dive sometimes and get in a better sense of, why people respond a certain way about certain ideas or beliefs. So I think that is something. So it is complicated when you add in theological language. I also recall that there was a poll that came out, I believe it was last year, and And in the poll, they talked about how the polling of some Black religious people aligned with individuals that were white that had more conservative views, right? And I think that one of the things to remember is that the majority of Black Americans are religious, and that the way in which theological language is used can sometimes, not all the time, can sometimes sway people in their decisions about certain things. So if you present particular issues based on theological beliefs and foundations, they're more than likely to lean one particular way or another. But in my experience, because as a practitioner, we like to break it down a little bit more and say, this is what this particular issue means for your community and your life on a daily basis. And I think when you frame things in the context of how it has implication on the person, the community, the people that individuals care about, then that conversation is going to look a little different than just using just theological language. But it is complicated when you have so many different religious ideologies, beliefs, and worldviews out there.
So we are at 3:18. This has been a wonderful discussion. I want to, so, and of course, we got 4 phenomenal questions coming in all at the same time, right at the end. So what I'm going to do now is do a little bit of a pivot. Every single one of our 12 sessions ends with the speakers addressing the same question, which is, what is your hope for the future of religious liberty? We wanted just a nice tie through and just give people not just what is the problem, but what are we working towards? What do we want to see in what this, how do we flesh out a vision of religious liberty that is rights enhancing, that does advance racial justice? So I'm going to fly through the 4 questions, and maybe you can keep those a little bit in mind as you answer that last question in our remaining time, because I actually think they are quite applicable. So we had a question about kind of both the possibilities, but also the limits of sort of an interfaith approach to religious liberty questions, and how kind of interreligious actions can accelerate justice through community partnership, but also, there's been kind of critiques of that as a lens. We had a question from Professor Eric McDaniel, as a quantitative social scientist who specializes in survey data. What are the questions we should be asking to better understand the linkage between race and religious freedom? A question from Reverend Kenyatta Chinwe about Black Christian clergy who are kind of on the more conservative side of the spectrum, and don't necessarily agree with some of the baselines of this conversation, and how to bridge that gap with someone who, in Reverend Chinwe's words, who elevates their religious identity over their racial identity, perhaps. And then how should the Supreme Court respect religious freedom, different from how they're doing now? So that's a lot to cover in a final question of what you see as the hope. But I think maybe you can kind of lend all of the things that people are thinking about and wondering about as you kind of take on that last question, and we'll keep thinking about it. So, anyone want to volunteer to start? I can cold call. I don't get to do it very much.
I will go first. My hope is that in the future, we will have respect for each other. And, I'm going to borrow Sabrina's words, as human beings. I feel like there is a lack of respect. It's kind of like, I acknowledge that you have a different religious belief than me, but I don't respect it. And I want respect. I don't just want acknowledgement. And so my hope for the future is that there is not just acknowledgement that I have a different religious belief, but respect for my religious belief. And I think that too often in answering the Supreme Court question, since I'm the lawyer on the panel, my issue with the Supreme Court is that there is a lack of respect for religious minorities. And so, yes, I'm all for everybody to have religious liberty rights, but when it really kind of says the religious liberty rights only go to this majority position and religious minorities are ignored, I have a problem with that. And so my hope for the future is that it won't be something that we have to discuss. Like, it would be something that there will still be religious freedom and religious liberty cases, but that there will be respect for other views outside of white Christian Protestant views.
Pretty much what I was going to say in a similar way, just in the broad sense that that my hope would be that the courts at all levels would learn to see the religious landscape as much more complicated than they do now, and that is inclusive of a variety of kinds of religious beliefs and practices and organizations and expressions than the current, to use my colleague Winnie Sullivan's language, the ecclesiology of the Supreme Court, what they imagine religion to be, much more complicated than it is now, that, in a way that would respect the diversity. And I would hope that people would continue to ask the question of what do we mean when we say religion in this phrase, religious liberty, and to become educated about the history of religion in America. I'll pitch my own field. The intersections of religion and race, how racialization and, in particular, conceptions of Black religion in the United States has shaped the very boundaries of that category of religion. And, I would hope that that kind of education would lead people to answer one of the questions, people who want to put their religious beliefs at the forefront and limit other people's access to religious freedom, that understanding this, again, complicated history of racialization would help them understand that it's a moving target, and they could be the next ones who are kind of put out on the margins.
Absolutely. One of the things that I hope for is that people will think about the words that Dr. Corey D.B. Walker said when he said that religious freedom from the onset was arrested in its development, and that it is still really being fully realized, and that in order for us to thrive fully as a society is that we first have to value every human being and humanity, and our right to human dignity and our right to freedom in this country. And so for me, it is the hope that we do, as I often talk about, reimagine religious freedom in ways that centers the human being and the human concerns and human needs of every person. And in order for us to do that, it takes exactly what this curriculum has done. Take people from different disciplines to have these conversations and not just lean on legal experts to guide us in this conversation, but to look at historians, to look at organizers, to look at scholars and practitioners to say, where has America fallen short in its responsibilities and duties to live up to the country that it hopes to be, because we're still a work in progress. And so it is my hope that everyday people will watch, the videos, will engage the curriculum, will read the materials, and then think about this more broadly in their everyday context. What does this mean for your local community, your local public schools, for the houses of worship in your communities, or people that gather together that are non-religious? What does it mean to continue to protect the safety and the space that they need to just be in community? So I think there are many things that I hope for as a result of this curriculum, and that people will continue to ask the question when they hear cases coming up, whose religious freedom are we really talking about? And what and who has been impacted the most by what is happening? I think those are, as people dig deeper in those questions and dig into this curriculum, then they will start to see, at least I hope they will start to see religious freedom a lot differently in this country, and the ways in which Black people have been treated, and then to all work together to help reimagine a better world for all of us.
That's a amazing place to kind of land the ship. Thank you all so much to everyone who's stuck with us. Thank you. I really hope you check out the curriculum, watch a couple sessions, and see how you can make it work for you. Have a discussion group, have a kind of book club style conversation, take it to your club or your congregation or your classroom, and reach out and tell us what you think. I mean, this is going to be a long-standing project. We want to hear how we can make it even better. And so just thank you so much. Thank you to all the curriculum participants and to everyone in the audience, and be in touch with us. Have a great rest of your afternoon.